Undercover boss grabs a muffin, freezes when the waitress says she can't even afford to eat one herself. Monday morning. A light drizzle fell from the sky, the pavement shimmering with reflections from still groggy storefront signs. Ethan Carter pulled his beanie low, hands tucked into the pockets of a worn hoodie, walking slowly past the low-rise buildings typical of the suburbs. He stopped in front of the fogged-up glass of Sunrise Bakery, branch number 7, peering inside with eyes hidden behind thick glasses and an untamed beard no one could quite read through. On paper, this was one of the chain's stable outlets. Revenue held steady. Customer ratings were acceptable at best. But when Ethan reached the HR Section 4 resignation letters in 2 months, citing vague reasons like internal pressure and lack of growth, he knew it was time to leave the office. Not by email, not through the regional manager, but with his own eyes. The bakery was already open. A small wind chime gave a soft tinkle as he pushed the door open, warm but not welcoming. Customers came and went steadily, mostly people grabbing breakfast on their way to work. The scent of fresh baked dough filled the air. The oven gave off its familiar ding like a steady heartbeat of the shop. But something felt off. No one greeted customers, no eye contact behind the counter. A girl stood making coffee, her face expressionless. A young man wiped the counter but glanced at his phone every 10 seconds. Every movement was in rhythm but lifeless. Among this motion, only one person never stopped moving, Lily. A young woman in her 20s, hair hastily tied back, wearing a faded apron and worn-down flats. Left hand holding a tray of pastries, right hand balancing a cup of coffee, eyes darting to check the new order printing out behind the machine. When a customer walked in, she was the first to step forward. When someone left, she was the one clearing tables, taking out trash, and resetting trays. She didn't exactly smile, but she never let anyone see her tiredness either. Ethan waited in line like any other customer, watching her from behind the faux wooden menu board overhead. Just another normal morning. Just another small bakery. But he knew the biggest truths are often hidden in the quietest places. And today, he was here to hear that truth. Not through reports, not through some corporate culture poster in a training manual, but through the smallest actions of someone quietly keeping an entire bakery running. Her name was Lily, and Ethan had no idea she would be the one to make him re-examine everything he once proudly built. Ethan stepped up to the counter, lowered his voice just enough, and pointed to a freshly baked blueberry muffin, its paper wrapper still damp with steam. "One of these," he said, then glanced quickly at the menu, "and a black coffee. To go." Lily nodded, her movements swift and efficient, but just as she placed the muffin into a paper bag, Ethan asked, not in a pushy tone, "Is this muffin really that good?" She paused for half a second, as if unsure whether it was a genuine question or just polite small talk. Then Lily smiled a small, sad smile. "That's what I've heard. But I haven't been able to afford one for a month now." Ethan frowned, not in judgment, but with the instinct of someone who had just heard something deeply wrong. Lily kept her voice light, as if telling a story not worth anyone's attention. "I need to save up for rent. The muffins are great, but one costs as much as my cheapest dinner." She laughed. But there was something bitter in that laugh like stale coffee grounds, the kind of laugh that makes you go quiet instead of laughing along. Ethan quietly took the bag. The hot coffee was placed beside it. He paid, left a tip, and walked over to the table by the window, the spot he always chose to observe the real heartbeat of a shop. In his hand was a blueberry muffin, still warm and fragrant. In front of him was a young woman, one of the very people holding this whole operation together, spinning like a top, never complaining, never stopping, and unable to afford the very pastry she was selling. To a typical CEO, this might seem like a minor detail, but to Ethan, who had founded Sunrise Bakery on the principle that breakfast should be the first kind act of the day, it felt like a punch to the heart, not because she was hungry, but because she was used to being hungry and had accepted it as if it were part of her uniform. Ethan sat down, coffee steaming in front of him, but the warmth did nothing to ease the cold spreading in his chest. One offhand comment, one muffin never tasted by the person who should have been the first to try it. And for Ethan Carter, that was the moment he realized something is wrong in the very place he once believed was the kindest part of his empire. Ethan remained at the table by the window, but his mind wasn't that of someone enjoying a morning coffee. Through the curling steam of his cup, he silently observed the rhythm of the shop. And within just 10 minutes, the misalignments began to reveal themselves. Lily, the girl who just said she couldn't afford a muffin, was spinning like a turbine through the busiest part of the shop. She was the one greeting new customers, taking orders, delivering trays, wiping tables, even taking out the trash near the coffee machine. Whenever a customer waved, only Lily stepped forward. Meanwhile, her two male coworkers, one tall with an expensive watch, the other with slick-back gelled hair, stood behind the counter chatting casually. They made no effort to hide how relaxed they were. Only when regulars walked in, those who called them by name, bought in bulk, or were known to tip well did, they stepped forward to take the order. And more importantly, they were always the ones holding the POS terminal. Ethan began to notice a repeating pattern. Each time Lily finished serving, she would quietly step back as the customer approached the counter to pay by card. Without missing a beat, one of the two men would step in, swipe the card, flash a professional smile, and walk away. Lily never once touched the POS system. Not even once. Ethan pretended to check his phone, but instead opened the internal management phone that only he and a few top-level tech staff could access. Sitting right there at the window table, Ethan entered the security code and accessed the employee permission log for branch number 7. A few lines of data appeared. Lily M. No POS access. No transaction ID privileges. R. Langford ID defaulted to all tips under $10. These transactions made up 82% of total orders in the past 2 months. Ethan drilled into a system entry. POS system update 4.2.1. Manual installation. Approved by D.W. Hayes. Purpose: streamline morning shift payment process. Doug Hayes, the branch manager, the same man who once sat in on corporate sessions about transparency culture at Sunrise Bakery, was the one who signed off on it. Langford, none other than his nephew. The employee who showed up daily, always held the POS device, and always smiled when the card reader beeped. And Lily? No ID, no permissions, no record of any tip received. Only one thing remained: her sweat and her silence. Ethan sat frozen. Numbers don't lie. A manual system patch. A privileged ID. An employee completely erased from any official recognition of her work. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a deliberate, sophisticated fraud dressed up as process simplification. And the ones who paid the price were people like Lily, invisible in the system, yet fully visible on the work floor. Ethan closed the tablet, his hand tightening around the handle of the now cold coffee cup. He knew that tomorrow he would come back here, not in a beanie and an old hoodie, but as the only person who could call the truth by its name and make the system listen. Ethan looked away from his phone screen, but the line, R. Langford, 82% of tips at branch number 7, was etched in his mind like it had been carved in stone. Outside, the rain had stopped, but a real storm was rising in his chest. He glanced over at Lily. She was bent over, picking up a crumb beneath the table just vacated by a group of students. No one had asked. No one noticed. But she did it anyway, quickly, neatly, and without complaint. Not far away, Ryan Langford leaned against the counter, giggling into his phone, one hand spinning his loosely hung staff badge. Doug Hayes, the branch manager, poked his head out of the office, glanced at the floor, saw everything was under control, and retreated inside as if assured by the efficiency. Ethan raised the coffee cup, took a sip, bitter, not from how it was brewed, but from the sting of injustice touching his tongue. He quietly scrolled through the POS permission matrix one more time. Something was becoming undeniably clear. Lily didn't just lack POS access. She also had no internal company email, wasn't included in the flexible shift assignment system, and didn't even have a full employee ID, just listed as L. Moore, morning shift support. A full-time worker, treated as part-time. A shadow, a name left in the margins. Ethan took a long breath and slowly ran his fingers along the tablet's edge. For a moment, an image from 10 years ago surfaced when he was the one baking at the first sunrise, wearing an apron, wiping down tables, knowing every regular's name and which muffin they liked best. And he knew, if someone had deliberately erased his name from the schedule back then, just to pad a relative's paycheck, that system wouldn't have deserved the name Sunrise, the name he once built because he believed in doing something decent at the start of each day. Lily emerged from the kitchen, set the tray on the counter, and began refilling the display case. Her hands were trembling slightly as she used the tongs, as if they were finally starting to feel the fatigue of 3 straight hours of nonstop labor. Ethan stood up. No one noticed. He walked to the door. The outside air was cooler than before, the smell of fresh pastries still lingering in his jacket. He didn't look back. But in his mind, everything was already in place. Tomorrow morning, he would return, not to observe, not to take notes, but to confront the system, the team. And all the other Lilies in his bakery chain those who carry the weight but are treated as auxiliary. And to those who have grown comfortable taking without being named, Ethan would be the first to read aloud what they had tried hardest to hide. Tomorrow, Sunrise Bakery would truly step into the light. Friday morning, the air was crisp, a thin gray cloud cover hanging over the quiet street like a veil. But inside Sunrise Bakery, branch number 7, a storm had already been scheduled. 6:59 a.m. The door swung open. The familiar jingle of the wind chime rang out. But this time, the man walking in wasn't a stranger in a worn-out hoodie. It was Ethan Carter, CEO of the entire Sunrise Bakery chain, dressed in a simple suit, his face serious, his eyes leaving no room for misinterpretation. Following behind him was Julia, head of human resources, and 2 internal auditors. They said nothing, but their presence alone shifted the atmosphere of the shop. Scattered customers looked up from their breakfast. Staff behind the counter straightened up. Doug Hayes, the branch manager, rushed out from the office, forcing a nervous smile across his face to mask the panic setting in. Ryan Langford quietly backed away behind the espresso machine, still holding the POS device he hadn't had time to put away. Ethan didn't waste words. "We're doing this publicly," he said, his voice not loud, but as clear as a bell in the suddenly hushed room. He placed an iPad on the counter. Julia tapped play. The audio began to play. No video needed. Just the voice cold and sharp enough to cut through the silence. "Tips under $10. Let the system auto-assign to Ryan's ID." "In Lily? She doesn't even have an ID. She does the work, but whoever controls the money keeps it." Doug signed off. "No one's going to dig into it, don't worry." Each sentence dropped like stones into a still lake. And no one moved a muscle. Doug stepped forward, his voice trembling though, trying to remain composed. "Mr. Carter, this was just part of a trial update. We only wanted to optimize the process. No bad intentions. Honestly, it was just to make management easier." "Oh, we're?" Ethan turned to him, gaze piercing. "Your nephew Ryan received over 80% of the total tips in the past 2 months. Meanwhile, Lily, the one working the hardest on the morning shift, wasn't allowed to process a single transaction." He paused. Then his voice lowered, but cut sharper than a blade. "You sat in the office vaping, signing off on fraud. Your nephew lived comfortably off stolen tips. And Lily? She drank coffee to soothe her empty stomach every morning. That's what you call optimization." Doug froze. Ryan had already turned away, eyes burning red. Ethan didn't need to say more. "Doug Hayes, Ryan Langford, you are both terminated effective immediately. System access revoked. Legal will be in touch." No one clapped, but no one looked down anymore. At the far end of the counter, Lily stood frozen, still holding the half-filled tray. She had never imagined witnessing a moment like this, let alone standing in the middle of it. Ethan looked toward her. "Lily." She lifted her head, eyes still wide in disbelief. But for the first time, she didn't avert her gaze from anyone in the shop. "I heard what you said," Ethan continued. "Not in a boardroom, not through an email, but right here where you show up every day and had once accepted being silent." Lily set the tray down, stepped out from behind the counter, not fast, not hesitant, but each step ripped through the fog that had quietly cloaked her for months. Ethan smiled softly. And in that moment, everyone in the bakery knew. Justice doesn't come from a title. It starts when one person dares to speak the truth and another chooses not to look away. And that day, at the smallest branch of Sunrise Bakery, a server who once lived on coffee became the reason an entire system had to change. Ethan took a step forward, his hand resting lightly on the worn wooden counter. He no longer needed to look at the iPad screen because every eye in the bakery was fixed on him, and everyone had already heard enough. "Julia," he turned calmly, his voice steady like a judge passing sentence. "Log this into internal records. Effective immediately." Julia nodded, her hand already poised on the tablet. No need to ask twice. Ryan, now pressed back against the wall, had both hands behind his back, eyes glued to the floor like he was searching for an escape route from the stairs around him. Doug stood frozen, lips tightly pressed, face drained of all color, with no words left to say. Any excuse had dissolved like sugar at the bottom of an espresso cup. Ethan turned to face the remaining staff. Some of the newer hires stood stiff as statues. Others clamped their lips to suppress a deep breath. Marta, the elderly baker behind the pastry display, paused mid-reach for a cookie, her eyes reddening. "We once said Sunrise Bakery was a place where the day begins with kindness," Ethan said. "But I don't believe. Kindness begins with fraud, or with forced silence." He paused, then looked toward the end of the counter, where Lily still stood frozen. "Lily," He called again, not as a superior to a subordinate, but like someone grateful, calling out to the person who helped him see the truth. She stepped slowly into the center of the room, hands no longer trembling, her tray of pastries left behind. The stares that once carried sympathy now shifted to admiration. No one saw just a fragile waitress anymore, but someone who had just cast light into a room, once held in deliberate shadow. Ethan's eyes softened. Thank you for not accepting injustice as something normal. Lily pressed her lips together, then nodded gently. No words needed. This silence was no longer one of submission, but of acknowledgement. She was no longer invisible, and never had she been weak. Ethan continued, starting today, all tip distribution policies will be publicly transparent within the central system. No more exclusive access to POS terminals. No more hidden system updates unless reviewed and approved by the Oversight Division. And most importantly, he looked back at Lily. Those who truly do the work will be recognized by their own names, not disappear inside someone else's reports. The atmosphere inside the bakery felt lighter, as if someone had just loosened a tight string that had been wrapped around everyone's chest for too long. A young employee at the back quietly whispered, finally. Ethan didn't need to pat Lily on the shoulder or hand her a medal. But in that moment, he turned to walk away. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something profoundly just brought about by a waitress and a man who refused to look away. Outside, the clouds had started to clear. The first rays of sunlight spilled across the street and streamed through the bakery's front glass, glittering on the wooden sign that read, Sunrise Bakery, begin with kindness. And now, no one doubted that message anymore. 1 month later, the sky was clear, and the early spring sun lit up the small street of everything seemed familiar. Yet to Ethan Carter, every detail now held a new layer of meaning. The wind chime on the door of Sunrise Bakery, branch number 7, still rang like every morning. But this time, that soft chime didn't simply signal a new customer. It was a familiar greeting, meant for someone who had once come in silence and now returned to see that what was right had been preserved. Ethan stepped inside, no longer in disguise and no longer weighed down like before. The space inside felt warmer not because of temperature, but because of the genuine ease flowing between staff and customers. Next to the cashier's counter stood a respectfully displayed digital screen. Its message was bold, but not flashy. Tip sharing policy. Transparent, fair, protects those who do the real work. Below it was the digital signature of CEO Ethan Carter. And beneath that, engraved on a polished brass plate, was a quiet reminder. No one should have to choose between doing well and being seen. From behind the counter, Lily stepped forward. She wore a crisp white shirt, a clean apron, her hair neatly tied back. Her new name tag shimmered softly under the lights. Lily Moore, branch manager. Good morning, Mr. Carter. She smiled, her voice no longer hesitant, but steady and clear, just like the posture she carried now. Someone who had walked through shadow and now stood exactly where she had always deserved to be. Ethan nodded, his gaze softening as he looked around the bakery. He walked over to the table by the window, still the same spot where, a month ago, he had heard Lily breathe out a sentence, like a knife cut. I can't even afford a muffin. Now, he sat down in that chair, watching the counter where she was instructing a new staff member on how to manage time during rush hours, calmly, clearly, and fairly. No hierarchy, no more stifled sighs. A young waitress ran by with a tray of muffins, glancing back and calling out, Miss Lily told us about you. You get free coffee today, sir. Laughter rippled gently from the counter. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. He poured a bit more sugar into his freshly brewed cappuccino, swirling the ceramic cup slowly, eyes drifting out through the clear window. Everything still looked simple and familiar, but now an invisible order had quietly been restored, built on trust. Ethan whispered to himself, as if to carve the words into his own memory. The most important things in a bakery aren't on the menu. Their trust, their dignity, and the courage to speak up, even when no one believes your voice matters. And that day, as the morning sun lit up the hot coffee cup, reflecting off the time-worn wooden table, Ethan knew. Some things can't be measured by revenue or reports, only by the first true smile of someone who had once been forgotten. Ethan sat on the same old wooden chair by the window, the very seat where he once hid in disguise. But today, he wasn't there to uncover flaws. He was there to witness something blooming. Outside the glass, sunlight pierced through the trees, casting a beam across the tabletop like a quiet blessing from the sun, sent to a place that had once harbored hidden injustice. Now, it had become the beacon of the entire bakery chain. Ethan quietly watched Lily, not to judge, but to remember. She was bending down beside a new staff member, helping them adjust the order timer on the POS system. No raised voice, no rush, only patient eyes, a calm demeanor, and a nod of encouragement. On the wall nearby, a new bulletin board had been put up. Morning shift staff rights, guaranteed at least a 15-minute break, one internal meal daily, and the right to submit anonymous feedback directly to headquarters. Beneath the board hung a small framed sign that read, "We don't build bakeries, we build a community." The bell from the oven she made a fresh batch of muffins was ready. Lily turned, nodded at the young kitchen assistant, and signaled for a server to retrieve the tray. Under the warm lights, the muffins gave off a rich scent of butter and blueberries, as if the bakery itself was breathing with the fragrance of its own revival. An elderly regular approached Ethan's table, smiling gently. "You're the owner, aren't you?" "That girl Lily, since she became the manager, the atmosphere here has completely changed. Thank you for letting her be herself." "I don't." Ethan simply smiled. There was no need to say that it was Lily who had brought this place and the system behind it back to life. Another young staff member, girl with soft pink hair, placed a steaming cappuccino and a blueberry muffin in front of him. Miss Lily said, "The first muffin is to remind us why we started." Ethan looked at the muffin. A month ago, the girl who served that very muffin had quietly admitted she hadn't been able to afford one in weeks. Now, the muffin was the same. But the hands that served it, the one who baked it, and the one receiving it had all turned a new page. He gently lifted the coffee cup, his eyes following Lily as she greeted customers with a natural smile, a smile no longer constrained by exhaustion. A smile no longer hidden behind a black coffee used to silence hunger. And in that moment, Ethan whispered not to anyone in particular, but as a message to every other Lily still working out there somewhere. The most important things in a restaurant aren't on the menu. Their trust, their dignity, and the courage to speak up, even when no one thinks your voice matters. Outside, the spring breeze blew gently. Tiny flower petals drifted past the window, whether by accident or fate settling neatly in the sunlight. Ethan bowed his head and took a bite of the warm, soft muffin. And for the first time in years, he ate not to test the product, not to evaluate flavor, but to remind himself, even a muffin can be justice. If it's given the right way, by the right person, a simple muffin, seemingly just another ordinary breakfast item, sweet-baked good among countless menu staples. But sometimes, it's that very simplicity that becomes a mirror, reflecting the things hidden in darkness. No one would have imagined that a breath-like confession, "I haven't dared eat one of these in a whole month," could expose an entire system run on silence, manipulation, and names erased from recognition. But the truly astonishing thing is this. All it takes is one person who dares to speak the truth. One person who no longer backs down when they realize they've been pushed aside. One person who stands up, even if their voice still trembles, even if their eyes still carry the weight of exhaustion. And then, from the very place that once silenced them, everything begins to change. Because the truth, no matter how small, once spoken aloud, is never small again.